President Biden's poll numbers are on a downward spiral. Major issues like the economy, skyrocketing inflation, and crime and gun violence are causing Americans all across the board to grow increasingly skeptical of the president. The Latino community is no exception. Democrats have enjoyed committed support from Latino voters, who happen to be the largest voting bloc by ethnicity. And while it's true that the majority of Latinos still identify as Dems, the 2020 election revealed that the party may be on shaky ground with this group. In fact, Trump managed to make significant gains with them, especially in Texas and Florida. Here to discuss the Democrats' relationship with Latino voters is Democratic strategist and president and founder of Solidarity Strategies, Chuck Rocha. Chuck, thank you so much for joining me tonight on Amplified. It's great to see you. Now, many people tend to regard the Latino voting bloc as a monolith, much like they do the African-American voting bloc. So can you explain the complexities of this base and how they are taken for granted when it comes to the courtship of the party?
Well, thank you so much. And that is a great lead-in question. The Latino community is so diverse, and it starts with country of origin. Cubans in Miami, as you know, Aisha, act much different than old Mexican rednecks like me from East Texas, who act really different than Dominicans that live in New York, or Mexicans from East LA and Los Angeles who have been there for generations. But on the voter file and with politics and with politicians, many times they put us all in this little bucket because on the voter file, it just says Latino, and they treat us all the same. What's really changed in the last few cycles is Republicans, for the first time ever, started spending real resources bilingually to have a conversation with a group of voters that Democrats didn't spend a whole lot of time talking to. And what you've seen now is an erosion of support. Keep in mind, the average age of a Latino in America is just 27 years old. And a lot of these young voters of color are not being talked to by either party. So they're starting to lose off little by little by little, moving over to the Republican Party.
And that's interesting because I think about millennials, the group you're talking about, and, you know, Gen Z too, but millennials in particular that aren't being spoken to at all by either party. And I wonder what you're seeing. You're saying they're moving over some to the Republicans. Are we seeing a dimming of engagement, period, or are we actually seeing a party flip?
Well, what we're seeing is they don't know who they are. Let's take Florida, for example, and the Orlando area where you've had all of these Puerto Ricans move since this horrible hurricane hit. What we found when we did an in-depth study around Orlando is that all of these newly registered Puerto Ricans registered as no party preference. They don't know if they're Democrat. They don't know if they're Republican. And nobody's really talking to them, explain to them the difference, because on the island, Democrat and Republican means something much different than it does on the mainland. And because Democrats have spent so much time talking to older Latinos, because they do show up and vote at higher propensity, nobody's really having a conversation with the younger demographic. And because Republicans have such unlimited money, they went really broad with all of their messaging. And because Donald Trump was known by everybody, that's where you start seeing the shaving off of support to Republicans.
Tell me more about how this simplistic view of Latinos is contributing to the Democrats' dwindling popularity with them. And I'm especially thinking about messaging here. It's interesting as you talk about how the Republicans actually had bilingual messaging and started to try to make appeals. So how are the Democrats really falling flat here?
Well, a lot of it has a lot more to do, I feel like, with timing more so than messaging. Yeah, you need to be more direct and more simplistic with your messaging. I've been a Democrat my whole life. My first race was Ann Richards back in Texas in the 90s. And a lot of times as Democrats, we show up with a policy book to a punching match, when we need to be a lot more simplistic. And what we're hearing in focus groups with voters of color is, no matter if they're a Democrat or Republican, tell me what this politician is going to do to make my life better. And that's what they really want to know. And that's what we should be leaning in on. But much more than that, we should start way earlier in having this conversation with these folks, because many Black, many brown voters, many diverse voters feel like the Democratic Party has taken them for advantage for a long time and just show up in the last few weeks when early vote starts.
Well, you have clearly been seasoned on the campaign trail in being able to bring forth a candidate that you thought made sense for Latinos generally. You were a senior advisor for the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2020, and you were specifically tasked with bringing out Latino voters. And clearly you were extremely successful at that. You even wrote a book about it, which we're showing right here. Biden and Bernie were neck and neck leading up to the Nevada caucuses. But by the time voters cast their votes, 70% of Latinos favored Bernie. I want you to tell us, how'd you do that? How'd you successfully win them over?
I won't only tell you that. I wrote a book to open source it so everybody would know how to do it, because I need more Democrats to win. And what my philosophy was is if I could get Latinos to vote for an old Jewish Democratic socialist from Vermont, somebody named Ortega or Lopez should be able to get Latinos to vote for them in Nevada. And what we did is we started 9 months in advance. We started with bilingual communication. We hired 100 young Latino organizers on the ground, and we treated Latinos, guess what? Like white suburban women, and spent a lot of money on TV, radio, digital, just like the Democratic Party does with a lot of white suburban voters. We prioritize voters of color there for 8 months. And if you do that over a long period of time and have constant communication and show up, this is the key, with some cultural competency, you can get communities to support you.
Oh, I need you to talk more about this, because I get so frustrated with every single election cycle, presidential cycle in particular. There is an archetype of a voter that Democrats are desperate to grab because they think that they're the make it or break it. It's going to be that white woman in the suburbs, like you just said, and we're always going to call her something, right? One year she's going to be the waitress. The next year she's going to be the soccer mom. I mean, we even went after Six Pack Joe that cycle. Remember him, the working class white guy?
Right.
There's always an archetype of white people that we care so deeply about, and then lump all the brown people and the black people into one category. So I am just curious how you made the pitch with, like you said, a Jewish guy from Vermont to actually invest in the Latino community in Nevada, which is such a consequential state for sure. But what did you say? What did you do to like really push that narrative that they mattered and that we needed to engage them?
Well, one is we learned from the 2016 elections that Latinos like Bernie to a certain degree, but we never really spent any time and resources like every other campaign. And I made the pitch that if we had this support when we really weren't prioritizing them, think what we could do if we really did. But here's the key, Aisha, is that there was a black or brown person in a room with budgetary authority to make decisions and to make sure that our community was on the right path to get as much money as the white voter. The difference in all the elections that we see across the country, in the top 50 races last year, there were only one manager of color. I take that back. There were two across the country in all the Senate and congressional races. So if there's not a black or brown person in the room with budgetary authority, a lot of times, guess which community gets left on the back burner? It's our community. There needs to be more black and brown activists in positions of power to make sure that our communities are not forgotten about when it's time to determine who's going to get what money and spent where.
That's one of the things I really appreciate about your work, Chuck, is you are always talking about how we get people in positions of power who actually make decisions. It's one of the reasons that as a young campaign staffer working on campaigns 20 years ago, I got asked where I wanted to be. Did I want to be in the field or did I want to be in finance? And I chose finance. So my career in politics is as a fundraiser, you know, in that area, because people who have access to the money, have access to the donors, are the ones who get to help call the shots. And there are not a lot of people who look like us in those seats at the table. So kudos to the Bernie campaign for making sure that was so, because the representation absolutely matters. I want to dig into Texas for a minute. Obviously, it's your home. Sure. It's a prime example of where and how we are seeing Democrats lose Latino voters. And I'm curious if you have a sense of what's happening specifically in Texas that you can share for us that's probably, you know, a microcosm of what we need to look for around the country.
After the last election, we did a deep dive into Hidalgo County and McAllen and those along the border that had dramatically overperformed for Donald Trump as compared to Hillary Clinton 4 years later. And what we found is, not surprisingly, that a lot of the modeling around if a voter is a Democrat or Republican based off of historical and algorithm models that are really data science driven do not really match up when it comes to people of color. Because guess what? Everybody knows this. People of color are more transient. They're more middle class. They move around. They don't have desktop computers. They're working on their homework on their cell phones. And that makes us not as reliable as that suburban voter who's got more money, who has a steady job, who hasn't moved in 5 years. So it meant that a lot of the data that the Democrats was working with was wrong. Secondly, you also see Democrats spend all of their money late, like they normally do, and Republicans make a long-term investment. In McAllen, we found through the Koch brothers Libre initiative, they had been working in the community for over 10 years, talking to the community about things that weren't politically driven, but around driver's license and translations and providing for the community. And so they had started making an inroad, and then you put in somebody that everybody knows like Donald Trump, then folks are like, well, he's saying drain the swamp. He's saying to prioritize America. That sounds pretty good to a poor Latino who came here to look for a better life, while they're not hearing, this is the key, an alternative message from the Democrats. So the Democrats need to get in the fight, talk about this as if, hey, this is your brain and this is your brain on drugs, dummy. All of those Republicans over there ain't really with you. They're just giving you a smoke screen. Democrats got to get a lot tougher about trying to court people of color.
What do you think is going to go down in the midterms that are coming up next year? Where are the places that we should really be engaging Latino voters and how? I got 1 minute for you.
You should watch Texas, watch Georgia, watch Nevada. Lots going to happen in these Senate races and these congressional races. But there are places that we lost congressional seats last time that have a majority people of color that went to Republicans, Florida 26, Florida 27, Texas 23. Watch if those split back. That's where the real coming together, the conduit of what's going on in America right now are these marginal House seats.
All right, we're going to follow it all, and we will have you back to talk about it. Thank you so much for joining me tonight, Chuck Rocha. We appreciate your insights on Latino voters and look forward to hearing more.